and this comes into the idea of state-dependent learning and things like that as well. So I think the unconscious mind really is, in some respects, a sort of genius part of the mind. It does hold all of the information, in my view anyway, as to everything that we've ever learned. And my personal opinion is that that unconscious part of the mind has effectively something akin to an HD high-definition recording of everything that you've ever experienced in your life. And it's to do with the associations that we've got within our conscious mind and the unconscious that allow us to basically pull up that information. And I think that's a really simple but nice way of looking at the sort of relationship between the conscious and the unconscious. I don't know what your thoughts are on this, Adam.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully my voice is coming through loud and clear now. I had issues connecting the Bluetooth to my microphone. I think there's so many different areas that a topic on the power of the subconscious can go. Obviously, we need to define what the subconscious is, and look at where this belief system comes from, that the subconscious is somehow powerful. And when you look at lots of different movies and kind of books and fiction, there is this kind of overriding narrative that we tap into very small percentage of our brain's capability. And if we accept that the conscious mind is limited in some way, which I think if you look at Miller in 1957, when he came up with the concept of the magic number 7 plus or minus 2, this idea of short-term memory, I think, overlaps quite a lot with the idea of mindfulness or conscious awareness of anything, in which case what we can say is that the conscious mind is really limited. There's so many limitations with the conscious mind, and therefore the subconscious mind, by definition, for us to do what humans are able to do, has to be very powerful. And I think what attracted me to hypnosis rather than many other different areas is this. It's I think the nearest thing we've got to a set of tools to tap into more of the subconscious mind than maybe other things, particularly other talk-based therapies. But this conversation isn't me and Rowan having a chat, it's us having a conversation with all of you. And what would be great is if you have a question about the subconscious, if you have anecdotes of how you've used your subconscious in a powerful way, would love to hear it. How do you tap into your client's subconscious in maybe a unique way? Raise your hand, we'll get you up here. Also, if you can see the little plus button at the bottom of the screen, that enables you to ping 2 or 3 people that you might feel have an opinion on the subconscious or unconscious mind. I tend to use those interchangeably. But again, if you have an opinion as to the difference between subconscious and unconscious, again, raise your hand. We'll get you up on stage. We'll have a conversation about it. So this is a real conversation. I think anyone attracted to hypnotherapy, hypnosis, at some level, I think has a belief that the subconscious is very powerful if we can tap into it in the right way. I can see that Derek has raised his hand, so we're going to get Derek up on the stage. Hopefully this is going to work. Here we go. Derek, welcome to the stage. What's your question or point?
Hey, well, really, I was just adding to the conversation that, a lot of the discussion here is about, recall and association of events, etc. But I think we've also got to remember and include the unconscious mind's physical abilities, that it can aid healing in quite dramatic ways. You can see physical changes happen. There's always anecdotal events where people have maybe burnt their finger and it started to blister, and then through hypnosis they've asked the unconscious to heal and repair, and the blisters virtually disappear within hours. So it's the unconscious is far-reaching in every single aspect of our physical being, whether it be brain function and memory and recall, but also body function and things like that. So I think that's a huge aspect of the unconscious that needs to be really explored.
I would definitely agree with that. I was speaking to a lady today she's had IBS for 30 years, and IBS is one of those few things that NICE, the organization that kind of approve drugs and medications, actually do approve hypnosis and hypnotherapy for that specific condition. And when you look at a lot of illnesses, many of them can't be attributed to a virus, a disease, some kind of physical cause. And therefore, we can say a lot of what goes through the healthcare system at some level is psychosomatic. You could look at, and there's increasing evidence that autoimmune issues at some level are also influenced as some kind of reaction to trauma. You know, there are peer-reviewed studies of things like fibromyalgia and ME and other things actually having a link to a traumatic event. So I would agree with you, Derek. I think there is a lot going on that, you know, isn't necessarily within our conscious awareness, and it's happening at an unconscious level. And I use biological reactions as an example of the unconscious, because as humans, we don't choose to blink our eyes unless it's a conscious blink. You know, we're blinking thousands of times a day unconsciously. When we take a breath, you know, as hypnotists, we encourage clients to take a breath at the frequency that we're asking them to, but we breathe unconsciously. You know, we walk unconsciously. We drive our cars largely unconsciously. So the human body has such a powerful ability to do things without thinking. And the anecdote, Derek, that I use to when people say, yeah, but your unconscious really can't communicate with you. Here's the anecdote I use. I say, look, have you ever been in the passenger seat of a car and the driver has pressed the brake pedal later than you would? I said, what happens to your foot? And they're like, it moves. It's like, did you do that consciously? And they're like, well, no, absolutely not. And I said, well, that's an idiomotor response. That is an unconscious response to a situation that's trying to keep you safe. You know, it's not, definitely not conscious. Derek, what's been your personal experience of the unconscious and how it overlaps with healthcare?
You know, as a hypnotherapist, we see these things, you know, almost on a daily basis. You know, there's things like allergies. I think is a prime example where, you know, I've had hay fever all my life. Since I was 14, it was my first encounter with hay fever, and you know, I suffered for years and years and years with hay fever, and it's an alleged reaction. I've got a biological background, and you know, I understand the chemical processes going on in my body with IgE molecules and release of histamine and the inflammation it causes, etc. And with self-hypnosis, this year, I've been symptom-free, absolutely symptom-free. The worst I've had this year is for 2 days I had kind of itchy eyes, and that was it. And I've had, you know, friends who have been going, oh, what a year for hay fever, I'm hating this. And I'm like, no, you know, my unconscious, I've convinced my body not to react to pollen. And it kind of blows me away every time I think about it. So there's a prime example.
I think it's a great example. And when you look at, you know, any autoimmune, you know, whether it's kind of psoriasis, you know, certain allergies, effectively it is a disproportionate response to whatever that stimulus is. You know, that might be, you know, the body sees a minor threat and it treats it like a major threat. You know, that's largely what's happening. And I think one of the things that, you know, we need to be careful of, I did a couple of hypnosis sessions based on this idea of boosting your immune system. And a lot, I got a few passive aggressive comments because they say you can't boost your immune system. Well, you can boost your immune system if you have a diet rich in green vegetables, salads, and high water content. You're giving your body exactly what it needs to be able to, you know, cleanse cells in a certain way. And also there were suggestions there about proportionality in terms of white blood cells. If you look at white blood cells as the primary way in which the body fights off infection, then the suggestion, you don't want to say, well, you have a bigger and more powerful immune system, because that's effectively what an autoimmune issue is. But you can say you've got the right level of response depending on the threat. and that kind of thing. I think, I've certainly seen some good responses in people. So thanks for your point, Derek. I think it's a vital part of the conversation is, the things that happen in terms of sickness, well-being, and the flip side of illness, I would say, is, things like well-being. It's having energy, it's having that enthusiasm, it's having clarity, all the kind of opposite ends of the spectrum there. Rowan, we know you as the encyclopedic, kind of knowledge base of all these kind of things. Is there anything that you've seen over the years that kind of link to the unconscious and kind of health and disease and well-being?
Yeah, I think, first of all, is everyone able to hear us okay? Because I think Adam's mic's a little bit quiet tonight. I'm wondering if mine's okay as well. So, Derek, are you able to hear us both okay? Can I just ask you that as soon as you're on stage?
Yeah, you're both not too bad. You're both pretty much okay.
Excellent, cheers. So, in regard to the subconscious and its ability to control this sort of stuff, I can actually take a story out of my own book with this. In regards to this, I had a really strong immune system up until the point my father passed away, and the stress of grieving for him and looking after my mother who was disabled, the negative self-talk that I was perpetuating within my own mind actually shut down my immune system to a point where I developed a fungal infection in my lungs that's normally only people that have got basically a completely shut down immune system will be susceptible to. So they look at people that are on like immune suppressing drugs or have HIV or things like that would normally be the sort of people that would get this infection. And it dissolved the top section of both my lungs within a couple of months. And it was all to do with the negative self-talk. I know that I shut down my immune system. And in response to that, I got this and my life was being threatened by this disease. And I made a conscious decision that I wanted to live. And I started doing auto-suggestion with myself about my immune system working properly and fighting this. And being able to heal my body through the idea that all of the particles of all the cells within my body are phasing in and out of reality all the time, so they should be able to phase into a healthy state, and suggestions like that all the way through it. And managed to come off the meds that they told me I would be on for the rest of my life in 2.5 years with diet and auto-suggestion. And I'm on my way to recovering. I can see new capillary growth in my lungs. And my view is that the unconscious parts of our mind are the parts that built us from a single cell. So within that unconscious mind is a map of everything for growing and regrowing any part of our body. And they've shown this in the embryonic stage that we can actually repair and regenerate parts of our body that get damaged and things like this. So the way I look at it is if we can take someone in hypnosis from being in a heightened anxiety state into a state of peace, we're affecting the GABA network. And this has been shown in Ernest Rossi's work. And if we can adjust neurochemicals and things like that in real time, in a matter of minutes, we have an immense level of control over our own mind-body system by using language. So language is really a powerful creative tool in the way our body responds to the world around us and the way we respond to our body. So yeah, I think that it's massively important.
Yeah, totally. And is my volume coming through a bit louder now, Rowan?
Yeah, that's a lot better.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, I can see that on my levels on here as well. So, I mean, one of the things that I think is useful, because the subconscious is a construct, it's difficult to actually measure, and kind of, you can't go into the brain and say, right, that's the conscious, that's the subconscious, and therefore it lends itself quite well to metaphors. And I think probably one of the most popular metaphors to represent the conscious versus subconscious is the iceberg, because everyone gets that there is more of the iceberg below the surface of the ocean than is above it. So for me, when I think about that, I think, right, well, what is the conscious versus the sub or unconscious? Well, the conscious is anything that you're actually aware of in the moment. And I think a lot of things that happen at the unconscious level can be made conscious. So you can have a memory that you've not thought about for years. And if you're asked a specific question, can you remember the last time you were on a beach? You might think back to a time that you were on a beach and then that memory that was unconscious or subconscious is now brought to the conscious mind, and you're mindful of that particular memory, in which case you're taking something from the subconscious to the unconscious. But if we agree with this idea that you can only be conscious of about 7 things, plus or minus 2, so up to 9 things at any one point in time, and I think that's the consensus, that it can't really be any more than 9, then it means that the simplest definition of the subconscious or the unconscious is therefore anything that you're not aware of in the moment is by definition in the subconscious, because you're not consciously aware of it. And if that was the case, the iceberg isn't the ideal metaphor, because it would be the equivalent of a tiny ice cube above the surface, and then this kind of, huge, something the size of a small island beneath the surface of the water. Because actually the vast majority, I think, of memories, fears, thoughts, beliefs, actions, even, physical responses, the kind of the skills that you can do. Like if you can click your fingers, that is an unconscious ability that you have, and walking is unconscious. So therefore all of these abilities are all in the subconscious mind, and therefore by definition it has to be a really powerful thing, because I wouldn't like to think about what living with only the conscious mind capability would be like, but it seems like it would be an absolute struggle. Rowan, what's the metaphor that springs to mind for you to represent conscious versus subconscious?
I think, before I go onto a metaphor, I think what you've mentioned there is really quite important, because if we look at having no subconscious and only having a conscious mind, that would mean that everything that's in the unconscious mind would have to be being processed by the conscious mind. And can you actually imagine your conscious mind if it had to be able to remember absolutely everything you've ever experienced and control everything in your body at this moment in time? It would overload. There's no way that we would be able to handle that without going completely insane. So I think the idea of the iceberg, and as you mentioned before, that this idea that the peak above the water is much smaller, and what's underneath it is massive. I think it is a really good analogy, and that's the one that I first came across with the subconscious conscious split. And why shift something that works? But I think you're right in that the unconscious part is much, much faster. So it's maybe more like a sort of the peak of an iceberg and the whole sea underneath, rather than just a huge iceberg underneath.
Yeah,
I think the idea of the unconscious is a really good analogy.
When I was doing talks, and I was there would be this kind of big PowerPoint projection of an iceberg on screen. I say, well, look, this is useful for you to get your head around, but if it was true, and I'd have one of these laser pointers, your conscious mind is the dot, that laser dot that you can see on the screen. And everything else in this room, is your unconscious mind, perhaps even the city. And that's the scale of difference I feel that the conscious and the subconscious mind is. And you're absolutely right. There is an absolute need for the unconscious mind, because, I say to clients, look, you might not like the fact that you've got an unconscious pattern here that means that you snack when you're stressed, or that you chew your fingernails until they bleed. But actually, for 99% of your life, your unconscious mind is helping you, because if you had to consciously decide to breathe every time you needed a breath, and you had to consciously blink every time you had to kind of clear your eyelids, and you had to consciously think about moving a leg every time you had to walk, where is the cognitive capacity to learn or think about anything new? You're overwhelmed instantly. And that's why, I think I really like this kind of move towards mindfulness, because I think it's a really positive thing of being present and appreciating what we've got. But we should be equally appreciative of the unconscious, because if you didn't have the unconscious doing what it could do, you could never be mindful about all those pleasurable things or enjoyable things around you. So another way of thinking about the subconscious mind is anything that you're not mindful of in the moment is therefore has to be operating at an unconscious level, because you're not mindful of it. Because the moment that you think about it, you're then mindful of it, and then you've brought the unconscious into the conscious. So, it's such a useful, powerful thing. But occasionally you've got this whole machine that's doing so much of your life. Yeah, it's going to run patterns on autopilot that aren't necessarily helpful because your life situation's changed. What worked in one situation might not work in a different situation, but it's running those old patterns, at an unconscious, competent level. Matthew, welcome up to the stage. Hi, you there?
I muted you, Matthew.
There we go. Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Excellent. Right. I'm glad this has come up tonight, actually, because over the last few weeks I've been thinking a lot about this, the unconscious and the consciousness and what have you. And I'm starting to lean away from the subconscious, unconscious template and looking more towards consciousness as being one, what's the right word to use? What system, for want of a better word, and that we have an inner conscious. Now, the way I look at it is that when we go into hypnosis, it's like zooming in with a telescopic lens on a camera, and you zoom in when you go into hypnosis to get to whatever the issue is that you want to deal with. And when you zoom out, that's when you're in what's the normal sort of conscious state, your everyday state, because you can see the bigger picture as such. Whereas when you go into hypnosis, you zooming in and you're looking at whatever it is you want to deal with. Now, if you look at head back to nature, how that plays its part, how we as humans, obviously the human species, is all part of nature, and how plants, how it's been proven that with even with trees, have a consciousness. How animals have their own consciousness. So why should we, as humans, have a subconscious and unconscious? Have one consciousness, but it's just that we more zoom in on it. It's more what's the word I'm looking for? It's more pinpointed when we're going into hypnosis to deal with certain issues. Does that make sense, or am I just rambling?
No, I mean, it totally makes sense. And I think that the first thing really to say about the unconscious and subconscious is, of course, it's not scientifically proven, that it's a model. And I think, if the model is useful, then it makes sense to keep the model. And if it isn't, well, then you replace it with a more effective model. And I think your representation of kind of almost like a zoom lens, that hypnosis enables you to zoom in. I mean, effectively, it's a similar thing to conscious, because whatever you zoom in, you're conscious of, and whatever you're not paying attention to, you're not conscious of. It just seems to me that rather than an iceberg metaphor, which is above the surface and below the surface, you're using a metaphor of honing into things that are important or zooming out of things that aren't important. So it's a different metaphor for a similar model. But I get what you're saying. Effectively, it has to be fluid, in the sense that you can't have someone with the conscious without the unconscious, and you can't have someone only with the unconscious without the conscious. Perhaps in certain conditions, people in deep comas that have no control over their conscious mind but can still dream, you could argue they have access to their unconscious but not their conscious, because they can't consciously move their bodies and things like that. But I think for a reasonably healthy person, can you have someone only with a conscious mind? I don't think you can. I don't think you can have someone only with a subconscious mind. So therefore, it has to be fluid, and it's just a model to represent the difference. And I guess the key thing is, what defines the difference? In your model, Matthew, you would say it's what you're paying attention to, what you're focusing in on. And in that iceberg metaphor model, you're saying, what are you aware of? And I think there's similarities of there, but it seems like you've got a different metaphor to think about the unconscious mind. But of course, like no metaphor is either true or not, because it's simply a metaphor. It's just whether it's useful or not. And actually, as you were describing that element of almost like a zoom lens to hone in on stuff, I found that a useful visual construct for me to think about the unconscious. So, it could be really useful. What's your thoughts, Rowan?
Yeah, I really like that, Matthew. I think that's a really nice way of looking at it, and it sort of made me think of the idea of the fractal nature of consciousness. And I think you're right. I think even potentially like rocks and stones in the mineral kingdom actually has a level of consciousness within it, because it has a pattern for how it's going to grow and respond to the environment. And it may be a very simple sort of view of consciousness within that kingdom within the world, but I think there's still a level of consciousness there. I think that one of the sort of metaphors for the conscious and subconscious that I quite like as well is this idea of the computer screen being the conscious mind and the unconscious being all the programs within there. And you could use your zoom in metaphor to zoom into the programs within the unconscious mind, and then in a fractal nature even zoom into different aspects of a single part or things like that and go even deeper and deeper within it and work in that fractal nature. So I really like that, Matthew.
I also like that metaphor of the computer screen as well. Sorry, so I'll just make a quick point, Derek, and we'll jump back to you. In the sense that if you everyone's got a smartphone these days, and you could think of your conscious mind is the app that you're using right now, and your unconscious is kind of all the apps that you occasionally use that maybe you've got open but you're not currently looking at, and then you could say your deep subconscious mind is all the apps you've ever got installed, because someone can only unconsciously juggle. They can juggle without thinking about it. If at some point in their life they've learned to juggle, they've taken it from unconscious incompetence to conscious competence, and then unconscious competence. So therefore, that's the equivalent of having an app installed, but they can't ever unconsciously juggle unless they're actually got balls in their hand and are juggling. So the element of a metaphor of kind of apps on a phone or apps on a computer, I think is quite a useful model as well there. Derek, you were about to make a point.
Yeah, it's actually, apologies, I'm just going to backtrack ever so slightly. It was just something I wanted to add to what you had said, that you had mentioned that, if we had to consciously think about every function we did, our breathing, our the flow of food through our intestines and all our thoughts consciously, we'd be overwhelmed. We wouldn't be able to function. And one of the metaphors I see is that it's a company, and there's this one office, and the office, the entity behind this office door is our unconscious. And it's so damn busy, that's why it has a room of its own, because it's doing so damn much all the time. And as a hypnotist, as a hypnotherapist, we have to, because of that, because it's separated itself from the rest of the mind because it has so much to do. And as a hypnotherapist, what we have to do, because it's so busy and it's locked itself away, that's why we have to knock on the door and ask permission to speak, because the unconscious is so busy doing stuff. So you can imagine it as a company with, the executive office that you don't go to unless you have to, because the executive behind the office is controlling the company. And I like to see it as a therapist. I'm the worker who knocks on the door and asks permission and asks for help. And the executive makes the changes as appropriate once it's persuaded by whoever to make these changes. Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense, and I think it aligns itself not just with a metaphor for the conscious and the subconscious, but also for parts therapy as well. I've used metaphors such as, you've got the chief executive running the company, but the chief executive can't run the company all by itself. It's got different departments that are good at different things, and in a badly run company, you've got infighting and bickering between departments. HR hates, the kind of accounting, sales hate implementation and all that kind of stuff. In a well-run company, there's good communication between different departments in a company, and I think that's quite a useful way for some form of thought parts therapy for better integration and cooperation. One of my favorite ones that I did was working with a lady that worked on she was in the Navy many years ago. So she knew all the different kind of departments of a warship, basically. And, you've got all these kind of things. And I thought that's a great metaphor for kind of what's happening, because the ship itself has some kind of mission or objective, but equally it can't function unless you've got all the crew fed every day. It can't function unless there is a doctor on board to cure people that are sick. And I think these metaphors are really useful in change work, but also to think about problems and where things aren't working, if that makes any sense at all. So yeah, very, very useful definition. But I think we can all agree that if we relied entirely on the conscious mind and just, if anyone had their unconscious mind switched off, if there was a switch that could do that, particularly these proponents of mindfulness, right? Just be mindful all the time. Okay, well, you're overloaded instantly. You can't possibly do everything that you need to do consciously in the moment. It's not possible. So that element of using the unconscious, something that came to my mind, and it's worth putting out there. I don't know if anyone's seen that. It was a TV show, I think, hosted by Philip Schofield, called The Cube or something like that. But what made me laugh looking at that is that you've got incredibly easy skills. It's like throwing a ball into a bucket or something like that. I think most people have had this experience of you scrunch up a bit of paper, you throw it in the bin, it goes in perfectly. You don't think about it, it just goes straight in that bin. And then you're like, wow, I'm good at this. And then you scrunch up another bit of paper, except this time you try and do it consciously and it misses the bin by a mile. And I think there is an element of that's why that TV show is such a fascinating thing, because effectively the whole premise of the show is to take really easy skills that if you just didn't think about, you do them straight away. And because you put them so much in the conscious mind, actually people get very simple things wrong. And I think that's because the subconscious mind is better at doing a lot of things than we are consciously. I don't know if anyone on the stage has seen that TV show or can relate to any of those experiences.
I can really relate to that, Adam. But also, I think I'd ask you the question as to, are you running on unconscious processes when you're working with clients? Do you forget afterwards what you've said half the time? Do we switch into that trance state and go into that autopilot mode when we're dealing with clients in that way? And also, when you're working with parts therapy, are you genuinely very appreciative and thankful and grateful for that unconscious part, whatever its purpose?
I mean, two parts to that question, ironically talking about parts. I was asked this question recently as part of a charity initiative that I was doing. And they were saying, right, do you go into trance? Do you use your unconscious when you're working with other people's unconscious? That's the best way of doing it. And I think that becomes very hard to do if you've got a printed out script before you work with a client. If you have such a preconceived idea of what protocols, what techniques you're going to use, even before the client's sat in front of you, then effectively you're not able to do it as well. I think you need, for me, the art of hypnosis is the fusion between the conscious and the unconscious. You want to, in my opinion, have the unconscious mind doing the heavy lifting so that your conscious mind can calibrate. I think that's the bit that you can't rely on the unconscious because it requires your senses. You need to pay attention to tiny idiomotor responses, nonverbal responses. You need to pay attention in the pre-talk, and the conversation before, to their tonality, the specific words that you're using. And I think if you're loading up your conscious mind with the preconceived idea of, I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to say that, well, how can you calibrate effectively? How can you really pay attention to the client in front of you? And for me, I think of hypnosis as a bit like driving, in the sense that the vast majority of driving is unconscious. You know how to change gear, you know how to accelerate at the right speed, you know how to change lane if you need to. But if someone was to slam on the brakes in front of you, you can go to unconscious to conscious rapidly. You could make conscious in the moment decisions based on your senses. And for me, that's what hypnosis is. You want to do the lion's share of it unconsciously, but still have sensory acuity to make conscious choices while you're in that process. For me, that's the right balance, I think. And also, it makes it more fun for me, because then it's my unconscious communicating with their unconscious, and I'm almost like an observer in what happens. I honestly don't know what I'm going to say or what I'm going to do when I'm working with a client. I'm sometimes surprised at the shit that comes out of my mouth. I'm just like, that was good. I have no idea where it comes from. I'm just like completely happy for my unconscious mind to kind of do this kind of stuff. And once you do it enough, you know, I think you do need repetition. I think you do need learning, and you need a feedback loop so that complex things become unconscious. But we can do so many complex things. Driving a car is tricky to learn, and yet we can do it while we're daydreaming. We can do complex things unconsciously. That's how powerful the subconscious mind is. It's an absolute genius thing. And for me, it's weird that we don't rely on our subconscious more than we actually do. And whenever I've tried public speaking consciously, I make a mess of it. When I just go up there with a rough intention of what I'm going to say, much better. You know, I should give more to my subconscious, not less. I think the second part of your question, which was about, am I grateful for the intention? Now I am. I don't think I used to be. I think when I was crippled by anxiety, I was resentful of these parts that had positive intentions. I tried to control them, you know, tell, you know, voices in my head to shut the fuck up and things like that. You know, was I really grateful that it was trying to protect me or help me in some way? Not really. But I think the more you work with clients, the more you see patterns in clients within yourself, and then you become more appreciative. I'm yet to find a conflicted part that didn't have a positive intention, you know, yet. Could happen. So therefore, if all of what we would label mental illness or anxiety or stress or self-harm, if it all comes from a positive intention, and you can negotiate that with that part to more ecologically and eloquently meet that intention in a way that doesn't have the negative side effects, then, you know, we can do a lot of good there. If there's anyone in the audience right now that has an anecdote about how you've used your subconscious mind powerfully, have you had that kind of moment that even when you think about it now, your kind of hairs on the back of the neck kind of go on end, and you're like, I don't know where that come from. So it definitely wasn't a conscious choice, but it was a kind of a magical moment for you, clearly driven by your subconscious mind. Raise your hand. We'll get you up on stage. We'll learn more about that. Do you have any questions about the subconscious mind? Are there things that are misconceptions about the subconscious? I think Derek's first point when he came up on stage was that, there is a lot of link, I think, with memories, almost like it's this kind of photo album, this kind of huge storage device. And I think for me, I don't think of it as kind of like the hard drive on a computer. I think of it almost more like a combination between the processor and the hard drive, like it kind of interchangeably. It's almost like artificial intelligence, I think, is a more useful way of thinking about it. But do you have any questions? Do you have any thoughts? Jessica, I can see you in the audience as well. It'd be great. I mean, maybe there's some reflections of your recent fight and that kind of stuff that you can come up on stage and talk about. But I mean, effectively, come on up. Let's have a chat. John, welcome up.
Good evening, all. Do I have any questions? The one thing that you triggered a thought for me when you were talking earlier about people that are locked into a deep coma. No doubt people have tried through hypnosis, but is there any evidence of people that have been able to communicate with people through the subconscious to bring them out of coma using hypnotherapy that you're aware of?
I know of people working with idiomotor responses and effectively a form of hands-on sort of magnetic pacing and reading using breathing to supposedly pull people out of comas. And I can't remember, I think it was a story from Tad James where he was talking about this. And I'm not 100% sure on that, but after he got the acquaintance or friend that he was helping come out of the coma using this pacing and leading on our breath or on his breath, chest movements, they were then asked to go around the hospital, and I think it was something like 20 coma patients we managed to pull out of coma using this pacing and leading of the breath. So I'm not sure about verbal hypnosis, but I do know that pacing and leading the unconscious mind, so communication with the unconscious through that way, can help lead people out, supposedly.
Well, that's amazing. Thank you. It's interesting stuff. It's just something that was triggered from the conversation earlier. But I guess if you think about it logically, it should be possible, because there's plenty of evidence that people that have been locked in a coma for a long time that have come out said, well, I knew everything that was going on. I just was unable to communicate that. So you would assume if that you would be able to assist. If I'm a big believer that you can help physical things with hypnosis. So I don't see why that wouldn't join the very long list of things that can be assisted with hypnosis. From a personal point of view, I believe there is a subconscious and a conscious mind that sits well with me. Because I think you can sort of lock things away. So at very least, I think if there is only a conscious mind, then it's definitely departmentalised in a way that you can lock away traumatic instances and not recall them without assistance. So I'm in the camp that there is the two, but whether we'll ever know. I follow a guy. I don't know if any of you follow a fellow called Andrew Huberman, who's a neuroscientist from Stanford, and he does a very layman type delivery of some pretty impressive neuroscience, and he's got a podcast which is pretty much weekly, but there's probably 35 back catalogue, and they're absolutely phenomenal. I can't encourage you enough if you're into hypnosis to follow him. And what he did for me was he put some meat on the bones, because I was aware that obviously the patterns that we run, the tonality that we run gets results, but it was bothering me that I didn't understand physically what was happening, what happens when you've got a memory, what's actually happening in the physiology. And he's put a lot of meat on the bones for me on that, and it's been really, really helpful. So as I say, I would urge anyone to follow him, because he's a genius, man.
What was that name again, John?
His name's Andrew Huberman.
Andrew Huberman.
Huberham, Huberman, and he's a Stanford professor. He's an ophthalmologist and neuroscientist, but his podcast is just jaw-droppingly simple, and he's also an advocate of hypnosis. So he's although he's a man of science, he advocates it and sees a place for it. He's really, really helpful. He does it. He's got a podcast just about everywhere you'll find him.
Perfect. I will check that out.
Very, very cool.
John, a quick question from me. In your life, can you think of any examples of something that you did that kind of blew your mind a little bit, and it definitely wasn't a conscious choice, conscious decision, conscious action, but you did something and it was really useful in the context, and it was probably your subconscious that kind of did that?
So it's a very good question, and when you mentioned it earlier, I was searching for something. I can think of lots of trivial instances where I must have been running on autopilot. And your example of driving a car, and after you've driven a car for so long, you do it automatically, don't you? And we've all had the experience of driving to a destination, and you suddenly realise you've done 2/3 of the journey and you can't remember any of it, and it just happened on autopilot where you were thinking of something completely different. You were in an altered state. So for me, there must be a period of time when you go from something that was learned, like driving a car, where it crosses over into the subconscious. But obviously there is plenty in the subconscious that isn't learned. We don't wake up every day and think, must remember to breathe, must remember to create all those red blood cells, etc. So there's plenty going on. Probably 99% of what's going on in the body is done on autopilot, which we didn't teach it to do. It happens automatically. So yeah. I don't know if that answers at all, but as I say, plenty of examples of things I thought, wow, how did I get here? Reactions, I guess, as well, when things have happened, near-death experiences with car crashes, etc., where you leap into action, but perhaps where you're in a lethargic state and then become in a heightened state very quickly. I guess that's the subconscious to a degree, but yeah. I don't know the answer.
I would agree with that. Dorian, we're going to come to you in a second, just because I want to kind of talk about a theory of how things go from the conscious to the unconscious. And, I think Bandler talked about it a lot in terms of levels of learning. So that, before you even try something, you've got this kind of, you don't know how bad you are. So you've got this unconscious level of incompetence. You don't know how bad you are. And then you try something for the very first time. It might be learning to read, write, touch type, whatever it might be. And then you realize you're awful at it. You're conscious of how incompetent that you actually are. And then if you persist it's easier if you learn from someone who already has the ability to do it. It reaches a point, which I call the strut stage, and you're like, yeah, I can do this. You're conscious of your competence. And then very quickly, the moment that your brain figures out that actually I can do this consistently, it tries to automate it, and that's the unconscious competence. And I think that levels of learning take place in so many different areas of our life. But the bit that I'm keen to add on there is that competence is a very ambiguous word in the sense it's anything that you can do. So you can actually learn how to do something really badly, and then that gets automated. We've all seen awful drivers on the road, and we're like, how did they get a license? And they're just doing it automatic. They don't even know how bad they are. But that's unconsciously competent based on the definition of competence. Is just they can do it. They can physically, kind of drive. And I think that probably has led to how we're able, as we get older, to do more and more things unconsciously because we've acquired the skills or the ability to do that. And I think that is a useful model when you're thinking about skills. Obviously, it doesn't really explain memory. I think that a better model of that is probably short-term versus long-term memory, as a way of if it's in the long-term memory. Rowan is shaking his head at me there, and he's the memory expert. He has a course on memory. So, what's your take on that? And Doreen, we'll go to you very soon.
Yeah, I think that one of the things off the back of what you were saying, it's important to understand. I think that all learning happens on the unconscious level rather than the conscious level. We try and learn something consciously until our unconscious manages to automate it. And this is really that point you're talking about of the unconscious competence kicking in, is where that unconscious mind's managed to build that program to run that process, whatever it happens to be. And I think that the idea of long-term and short-term memory is, again, a construct like conscious and unconscious. It allows us to explain something in a certain way, but really it's more of a zooming in and out in sort of similar to what Matthew was talking about with consciousness, where the memories are more sort of fractal based, and you can see that in the way you can build memory palaces. And working with artificial memory techniques like that, you can really start to gain an insight into how to put things into unconscious storage long term. So I was actually thinking about this and using the idea of a memory palace to install things like swish patterns and other NLP patterns within that memory palace, and designing a memory palace around someone's house, around their life, around their work, to install those swish patterns at particular moments. And we do this a little bit in the swish patterns anyway, but just taking that to the next level by installing it in a full memory palace, so that all the points throughout their life actually build that palace first. And I think that we can do this consciously using different artificial techniques for memory, as they're called. But we can also train the unconscious to do this by doing other techniques like reviewing at the end of every day and going over things. And this is an interesting thing in regards to future pacing and parts therapy, because if we review something 5 times, it will stick in long-term memory. So if we do that future pace and make sure they go through 5 future paces, it tends to stick for them much better in my experience than it does with just 1 or 2. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I think it's fascinating. I'll give that some thought, and we'll return back, I think, to memory in a second. Doreen, we've had you waiting up on stage for a bit. What's your thought, question, or something you'd like to share?
Well, I've been taught a very simple model on the conscious and unconscious. So the conscious is like the 7 bits, and this could be minus or plus 2. So the 7 bits of information that we can see in our awareness or feel or whatever, and all the rest of it is unconscious. And of course, the 7 bits plus or minus 2, they change all the time, so they can change by any second. So that's one thing. And the other thing, you were asking for some information or some bridge between the unconscious and the conscious. So several years ago, I was sort of in a state of waking up, and so this baby head jumped in my head, a tiny baby head, and it said to me yeah, you're pregnant and I'm healthy. And I thought, well, so I woke up straight away after that. So I thought, well, this is weird, I'm just only 3 days late, so I don't know what's happening here. But anyway, I turned out to be pregnant. And the weirdest thing was that when my son was 9 months old, I took a picture of him. And so when I developed it or looked at it when I was finished, the picture, I thought this is exactly the same face that I saw at that moment. So when he was just like maybe 3 days or a week old, and so I thought that was something I'd share here.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard too many stories like that to think, is it just coincidence? Is it just, selective bias of kind of memories? I think there's more to it than that. And I agree with that definition, Doreen, of conscious is that 7 plus minus 2, the thing that you're aware of in the moment, and everything else is in the subconscious at some level. I think is a helpful definition because it makes it really simple. And you're right, it's very fluid. Right now we're conscious of, what we're talking about, but if I said, right, is everyone aware of, the feeling of their foot in their shoes for a split second? That's one of your 7 things that you're kind of conscious of. So it changes rapidly. And that for me is what hypnosis is about. It's kind of steering the attention of an individual so that the majority of those 7 things are inwards rather than outwards. That's how I define a trance state. Is mindfulness for me is that 7 plus or minus 2 things are external sensory things. That could be the taste, the smell, the sound, the sight of something. If those things are inwards, if you're thinking of a memory, if you're thinking of a sensation or a feeling or whatever it might be, and those are inward sensations rather than outward sensations, that's my definition of a trance, because the majority of the focal attention is on inward senses rather than external senses. And by having that element of conscious versus subconscious, trance versus non-trance, because there is a lot of, I think, labels and kind of theories about what trance is, right? Are people focused inwards or outwards? Someone could use all 7 of their conscious awareness to remember one memory. They could remember where they were physically, location, what the sounds were around them. They could, remember details, like how they were breathing at the time. And if the majority of their attention is on a previous time that has to be inwards, that's a trance for me, and it keeps things nice and simple. If anyone in the audience has any other questions, theories, ideas, I mean, one of the things that we haven't really talked on about too much is intuition. And for me, I feel like intuition is the way in which our subconscious communicates with our conscious. That's a very simple definition for me. One question is, the power of the subconscious, is it powerful? Yes. But the thing with any kind of power is it could be used for good or bad. So if people, when I was a recluse and crippled by anxiety, my subconscious was making my life an absolute misery. I had constant thoughts of things going catastrophically wrong. It was making my heart beat out of my chest, not consciously. You can't, there's a few people that can make their heart beat 200 beats per minute consciously, but the vast majority of us can't. It's an unconscious response. So my subconscious mind was absolute creating hell. It was a prison of my own making. But I had this intuitive thought that, what if I'm creating this at some level? And if I didn't have that intuitive thought, I think I would be probably drugged up on medication or dead right now. So I that's how I interpret, the intuition is, at some level, all of this resources, memories, values, beliefs, all this kind of thing, at some level can communicate with you with an idea, with an insight, with self-talk. Rowan, what's your thoughts on what intuition actually is, and what's your definition of it?
Let's go to Derek first, because I think he was wanting to say something a moment ago. What was your...
Thanks. You know what? Oddly enough, it was about intuition. I use I'm a huge fan of intuition, and in so many different aspects of my life, I've learned to actively listen to my unconscious and literally, almost hear it speak to me in plain English. To give you a little bit about my background, I've got my fingers in several pies here. I'm a freelance body language analyst. I work for mainstream media, things like newspapers, OK magazine, stuff like that. I'm also a tarot reader. Excuse me for all the skeptics out there. And I advertise myself as an intuitive tarot reader. I also am a mind reader, stroke mentalist, corporate performer. And in all of these aspects, I heavily rely on my intuition. One prime example, many years ago, and we're talking a couple of decades back, I was in a bar, in a hotel restaurant, and with a friend. At the same time, there was a wedding function going on. There was people standing had spilled out from the wedding and were standing at the bar to cool off. And I was chatting to my friend, and out of the blue, I said to her, "Sit beside me. These guys at the bar are going to argue in a minute." And 5 minutes went by, and suddenly they broke out in this big argument. And I had, I could see them sort of like over her shoulder, and it happened. And I had no idea why, but my intuition told me, I instinctively and consciously read the body language. And obviously, while I was talking to my friend, they were in my field of vision. And I unconsciously, obviously, observed, subtle changes in body language. And the argument happened. But as in the same way as a tarot reader, I simply use my intuition. And you pointed out, allowing your subconscious to come to the front when you're doing therapy. That's a great idea, but the brave part is actually listening and acting, believing what listening to your unconscious mind, and then actually trusting it and acting on it. I mean, as a tarot reader, things have come into my mind, abstract stuff. And in the early days, I would push that to the back of my mind and get on with the job. These days, if my unconscious says something, if I intuit something, I will say it. And the results are far more profound in all aspects of, the various things that I do. As a performer, as a tarot reader, as a body language analyst, I listen and I act. And sometimes you have to be really, really brave, because sometimes your unconscious, or your, shall we call it, intuition, tells you something that's maybe a bit off the wall. And a lot of the time you can suppress that and say, nah, I'll just ignore that and carry on. No, trust me, guys and girls, get out there. If your intuition tells you something, if your unconscious feeds you that little nugget, act on it. Absolutely, act on it 100%.
I'm going to add something to that, Derek, because I think it's, there was a time in my life where I did act on my intuition, and it paralyzed me, it crippled me. It meant I didn't even leave the house, because my intuition was telling me I'm in danger, something's going to go wrong, and effectively, I think there is an element of, if your subconscious mind is filled with fears and beliefs about a lack of worthiness and things like that, then, garbage in, garbage out. What your intuition is going to tell you is going to be lots of things that aren't that helpful. I'm very intuitive now, and I trust my intuition now, because I think it's built up that trust with me consciously over time, that I've learned to be able to trust it. And it sounds like the same thing has happened with you, Derek. But, someone that is agoraphobic and never leaves their home, or someone that, effectively has severe anxiety in a different area of their life, or is feeling depressed, they probably believe that they're following their intuition, because the unconscious for them is giving them a warning sign not to do something, and they're listening to it, and it's making their life miserable. So I think for me, if we say that intuition is just the language of the subconscious, then if you've got a good relationship with your subconscious, and I love my subconscious now, but I didn't always, and it caused me absolute havoc in different times of my life, then I think that intuition is going to tell you different things, because as hypnotherapists, we know loads of clients that have got horrible inner self-talk, harsh criticism, mean words. There was a client that I worked with thanatophobia that would have over 100, we're talking like worse than the worst horror movie, images of his death, skin coming off his body, the worst possible things, consistently in a voice telling him that everything's meaningless because he's going to die. That's not a conscious thought that he had. That's not mindful thinking. That is his intuition telling him that, because it was coming from a particular place. So I agree personally with you, Derek. I trust my intuition, but I think asking everyone to trust their intuition might not be so useful depending on what's happening in the subconscious mind of particular individuals. Does that make sense, Derek?
It does. I think it really is how you define intuition. I mean, I think there's the subconscious can give you a behavioural pattern that it constantly reminds you of. For instance, I'm not worthy, and that becomes set in stone, both unconsciously, unconsciously and consciously. But where I think, for me, intuition is quite contextual. It jumps out, spontaneously. It's not something I live with, like a belief that I'm not worthy, that I live with day to day. For me, my intuition speaks randomly on occasion, or when I actively listen out for it, during a performance or during work in some aspects, I actively kind of tune in and listen for an unconscious response. So I think that there's for me personally, I would kind of differentiate between a kind of learned attitude, learned behavior, which I wouldn't really say is, intuition, but certainly when I need it, I listen to it and act on it.
And I think intuition is subjective, of course. It's an interpretation of a feeling that it has some kind of meaning. If an individual has the belief that they're worthless, that their life is meaningless, that they have no value to the world, and those are entrenched beliefs, perhaps even convictions, then their intuition might say stuff like, why not get absolutely drunk? Your life's a waste of space anyway. Why not kill yourself? Nobody's going to miss you if you're gone. That could be the ripple effect, the echo of the intuition that comes from these beliefs that aren't, there's a whole argument as to whether beliefs are true or not. I look at beliefs of, are they useful or not? And when I had lots of beliefs about myself and my life that were disempowering, a lot of my intuition was very negative and limiting in some way. When those beliefs changed to be a bit more optimistic and useful in some way, then the intuition became a bit more useful. Rowan, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I think that intuition is, I don't know if Derek or if anyone else here has ever heard of the green language, or the language of the birds, and the idea that there's a divinity talking to us through nature, through language, through the phonetic Kabbalah. And I'm sure Derek's probably in some way sort of familiar with the idea of aligning the tarot and the tree and using that as a balancing system for psychology. But this idea of the green language is quite interesting to me, because it's really the idea that there's some part of the universe outside us talking to us. And as a hypnotist, my understanding is that the entire universe I experience is a manifestation of my mind. I'm the magician that makes the sky blue, that makes the grass green. And everything that I ever know, everything that I've ever experienced is in that unconscious mind and created in my mind in that respect. So when nature's talking to me through synchronicities, through intuition, through random noticing of pieces of body language or things like that, I class that as my unconscious or superconscious parts of my mind talking directly to me. And if you've read My Voice Will Go With You by the Teaching Tales of Milton Erickson, at the back of that there's some information on using muscle reading to find hidden pins, and using like subconscious throat reading and lip reading to get names of what people's parents and things like that. And Erickson himself repeated false names for his parents over and over in front of a psychic, and they psychically got the wrong names for his parents, and they got the names that he was repeating over and over in his head. And he'd written a prediction and put it in someone else's pocket before they went to see this psychic or something like that. But the level of sensory acuity that we can actually train and get to allows us to do things that appear to be superhuman. And that is part of this, what we would normally class as being the subconscious mind or the superconscious mind, becoming part of the conscious mind. And we gain the ability to open that up, which is tying back into Matthew's idea of this zooming in and zooming out of reality. And I think the more that we can start to tune in and make those things that would normally be intuition become conscious awareness, the more we can learn to actually interpret what that unconscious mind would normally be telling us, because it's no longer unconscious, it's now conscious. And so I think in that respect, that more powerful than just intuition on its own. It can become a real ability to effectively read minds through micro gestures, through non-verbal communication, through tiny muscle movements and things like that. And we do get a sense of something's about to brew there. We get a feeling within ourselves. And we could even go as far as looking at some of the work done by places like the HeartMath Institute, where they've looked at people's EEG brain scans, and they can tell other people's heart rates in the room. So they can count the amount of people in a room, and they can tell their emotional states from the heart field, from the electromagnetic imprint on the heart field. So supposedly, anyway, I've not looked at the research in great detail or been sort of there when they've done it, so you can never really say for sure whether this is genuine science or not. But it looks to us like that we have the ability at least to pick up other people's heart rates within our brain. So that unconscious mind can potentially pick that up. And at the same time, it can potentially feel what emotional state they're giving off within that heart field. And if that's true, then that gives us a massive amount of potential power to explain some of these intuitive things that happen when we're getting these sort of indications from the unconscious that, oh, maybe we shouldn't trust this person, or, oh, maybe like this person's likes us, or this person hates us and is really angry with us, or whatever. And I think through that sensory acuity training, we start to notice these things. Through presence, we start to notice these things. And this takes us back to this idea of mindfulness. And it's another metaphor for the conscious unconscious, is this idea of the conscious mind, as you say, being a processor, but being a 7-core multiprocessor. And normally most people have very little control of a single core. And through doing focused meditation, you can start to open up those cores and keep track of multiple things. And that's where we're really opening up that conscious control of those 7 cores, plus or minus 2 or 3 or however many it is. I think the definition's out on that really as to how many possible points of awareness. But I think in the Eastern system, they say there's only one. It's just really good at switching very fast between multiple things. So I think intuition is really powerful, but I think we should look at it as something that we can move into conscious awareness. And I think we should look at the whole system. Like, this idea of conscious and subconscious is really effectively just a construct to allow us to explain this. But we can adjust how much of that iceberg is above the water and how much is below.
I think it's a good way of looking at it, because I mean, effectively, that sensory acuity, it can be in the outside world, but it can be also in the internal world. Isn't that what submodalities is in NLP? Distinctions on the inner world. That inner image that you have, is it brighter? Is it darker? Is it bigger? Is it smaller? Is it 3-dimensional? I don't know if I could be a hypnotherapist without the submodality distinction of association versus disassociation, and that's a single submodality. So I think the more we increase the sensory acuity of our inner world, then at that point you can pay attention to the average person that talks about and they'll literally say, and I say to myself, I'm a worthless piece of shit, and they'll just literally, and it's like, okay, is it your voice? Is it someone else's voice? Where's it coming from? How loud is it? Is it fast? Is it slow? All those kind of things. And for the first time ever, they're actually awareing that it is actually a voice inside their head, and that's the level of unconscious. So I think having increased sensory acuity of these things that we don't normally pay attention from gives us the ability to control it. And if what we're talking about, Rowan, is, there is almost a bridge between the unconscious and the conscious that is constantly moving, depending on what those 7 ± 2 things are, then effectively, isn't that what we do as hypnotherapists? We're constantly bringing stuff out of the unconscious mind into the conscious, making a change at the conscious level, or sometimes even the unconscious level. So when it goes back in the subconscious, it runs a different pattern. It certainly works differently at that point. And who knows what's happening biological? Is that one additional link, one neuron attaches to another one, so there's an additional neural pathway that wasn't there before? We can't possibly know that in terms of the intricacies. One day maybe it's possible to actually map the neural pathways in the same way they map the genome, but right now that isn't possible. All we really know is that something's different after the therapy than was there before. But sensory acuity, I think, is an important element of that, subconscious mind, and harnessing the subconscious mind. And I think it's also worth thinking of, if the subconscious mind is so powerful, why are all people not super successful, super talented? You look at things like recent Olympics, and I think what we've got to say is that, yes, the subconscious is really powerful, but only if it is directed by the conscious. These people that have won gold medals have made conscious decisions about certain things they're willing to sacrifice in their life, the amount of training they have to do, what's important to them. They've recovered from injuries. They've learned from stuff. They've gone out and still did the training even when they were tired and exhausted. They've picked themselves back up after a defeat. And you see this with things like the Wim Hof method, people voluntarily putting their bodies in very painful, freezing cold conditions, because at some level, what we have to accept is the conscious mind can fundamentally disagree with the subconscious response, overrule it. We can always take manual control over that autopilot. And the most successful, the most talented people have a collaborative working relationship with their subconscious mind, but they're not afraid to pull rank. And they say, right, if my subconscious mind doesn't want to do this, but you know what, I've weighed everything up and I want to do this anyway, then 9 times out of 10 I've seen the subconscious mind gets on board. It's like, okay, you're the boss, right, let's do this. Rather than, if the subconscious mind is primarily in control and you value laziness or comfort above, success or whatever else, well, actually, your subconscious mind, if that's ruling the roost, you can see people, not doing very much because it's a reflection of their values and their goals and that kind of stuff. So I think, yes, the subconscious mind is really powerful, but you can't let it run on its own devices. If we say that unconscious competence is a valuable part of the subconscious mind, everyone has to make conscious decisions to what to learn. You can't unconsciously drive a car if you've never learned to drive a car in the first place. You can't unconsciously speed read, if you've never learned to read to begin with. So there is an element of, the subconscious is really powerful, but only with conscious direction. Any thoughts from anyone up here? It doesn't have to be from Rowan. Anyone on the stage here, as to answering the question: is the subconscious actually powerful, or actually is it just this kind of thing, this tool that is just there, and we're carrying it?
I'll just give you a little argument for how powerful the subconscious is, and it comes from a book by William Walker Atkinson, Your Mind and How to Use It. And he says that we're taught in school that our conscious mind's the analytical mind, and the unconscious mind's the storehouse of memories and emotional information, so on and so forth. He says this is a fallacy. The truth is the unconscious mind, or the subconscious mind, is the true powerhouse of analysis. And you can tell us yourself if you've ever fallen asleep with a problem and woken up with the solution. Did your conscious mind come to that solution, or was it your unconscious mind? And in that book, he teaches it a method of loading the unconscious mind with information with the view of working on a particular problem, and then stepping into that problem and seeing how the unconscious is dealing with processing that information and solving the problem for you. So I think from my perspective, there's a massive power in the unconscious. I'm not sure what anyone else is talking
I think also, just while anyone else has any thoughts on this, for people that can speak multiple languages, the first language you learn is unconscious. You might learn a second language on an app or in a classroom. That's conscious learning. But the first language, you didn't learn, these kind of rules of grammar and language patterns in a classroom. You learned it by immersion. Your unconscious mind was surrounded by all these different things, and you picked it up. That's how the vast majority of people develop their belief systems. They acquire the belief systems of their immediate environment, family, and things like that. We learn intuitively, we learn unconsciously. Now, if you're surrounded by people with really empowering belief systems, great, you're unconsciously learning all these kind of your model of the world. The vast majority of us, though, didn't grow up where we had perfect parents, perfect role models, that people handle difficult situations like stress and anxiety and money worries in the best way, and we modeled all these. Actually, we learn all these unconscious beliefs and patterns and coping strategies largely from the people around us, and then that became our unconscious competency. We just have these patterns locked and loaded, ready to go. And that's why, in adulthood, people are firing off these patterns unconsciously, and then they've got issues. I see that's our role as hypnotherapists, to see if we can say, well, knowing what we now know, would we voluntarily choose to have that belief? Would we handle that specific issue or problem in the way that we happen to do it? And another metaphor, I guess, for the mind is programming. How many NLP books have we read with the subheading "Reprogram Your Mind for Success" or something like that? I mean, effectively, it's a popular metaphor. But the reality is, if you've got an app or a program and it doesn't run right, you change the code. You consider it beta testing and you change it for something else. So if you've got things that aren't necessarily useful in the subconscious, having this kind of intentional desire to change it, I think is very useful. We're all different people now than the people we were before, fundamentally, because we've got this ability to learn from stuff. And, I think a lot of people intuitively, and that word's come up again, how many times have we left a meeting, an interview, some kind of interaction with another person, and replayed that over and over in our minds to think, I wish I'd have done that differently? Is that not you taking something that happened probably unconsciously into the conscious, effectively doing a rewind technique and kind of playing it again? And then when you're happy with the outcome as you wanted it to be, well, then suddenly you've got a better model in your mind for how to deal with a similar situation, in the future. If that's not, a really positive relationship between the conscious and the unconscious mind to learn from experience, I don't know what is. But for me, I think it has to be synergistic. It has to be harmony between the conscious and the unconscious mind. We can't say, the subconscious is all powerful, just trust your subconscious mind. Yeah, let's trust it, but equally, let's challenge it every now and then if it's not, helpful in some way. Let's assume that not everything in the subconscious mind is perfect just because it's in the subconscious mind, because it's spitting out a lot of bad code, a lot of kind of childhood beliefs based on, maybe ineffective role models and blueprints. So, yes, it's powerful, but fundamentally, the conscious is the captain of the ship, and we've got to steer it in that direction that we want it to be. Otherwise, we're a victim of our subconscious rather than harnessing our subconscious mind. Appreciate we're getting towards the end. We have extended today's session by an extra half an hour. It's been a fascinating conversation so far. If there is anyone in the audience, we've probably got time for maybe one or two more hands to be raised for any points to be made. Do you agree with what we've said? Do you disagree? Raise your hand. It'd be lovely to hear from you. If anyone up on the stage, Doreen, Derek or John, have any final points to make, again, take yourself off mute. Great to hear from you. and we'll be winding down probably in about 5 or 6 minutes. Doreen, I can see you've taken the mic off.
Yes, but you were talking about languages, and well, English is not my first language, and well, I was interested in the English from a very young age because I love music and I wanted to learn the lyrics and all of that, and so I started at a very young age. But when I was 29, I lived in New Zealand for 1 year, and so when I started dreaming in English, that's when it really shut off. You know, I didn't have to think about the words, and obviously I'm still learning learning new words all the time, but I'm still interested. I still look at a dictionary and look up words that I don't understand. But you know, it's a learning progress, and learning is a lot of repetition. That's why people who have talent, you know, you have to, or you have a gift, you have to pursue it and make your talent greater, you know, and you can use the unconscious to help you. You have to give the unconscious instructions, and those instructions have to be like direct and really, you know, enticing for the unconscious mind. And on the other hand, if there's trauma, yeah, it's a lot more difficult to sort of tame the unconscious to do what you consciously want.
I think it's interesting, Doreen, that, you know, we've spent nearly an hour and a half talking about the subconscious, and this is the first time that dreams have really come up. But clearly dreams are, you know, definitely, you know, we don't have conscious control. You know, there's an element of lucid dreaming, but when we're actually in sleep, in REM sleep, there isn't conscious control of the dreams. I'm going to share an anecdote that I feel definitely had some kind of positive intention. It was definitely my own unconscious mind. When I was 21 years old, I went to work for my uncle in Florida, and I was washing dishes. I was a dishwasher. It was the worst job I've ever had in my life. And I was washing dishes for about 10 hours straight. Worst thing in the world. And Doreen, do you know what I was dreaming of that night? More dishes. Not only did I have to do it in the daytime, but I was dreaming about it for the entire night. And I woke up and I thought, right, I spent a whole day washing dishes, and now I've been dreaming about washing dishes. But something interesting happened. The following day, I was able to wash those dishes without thinking about it. I could funnel my mind to do all this other stuff, and I could pick up the plate. I could do whatever I needed to do, put them out completely on autopilot. And my unconscious mind, I felt, was doing me a favor. It's like, okay, in your dreams, we're going to master this skill so you don't have to think about it. And you know, that for me was like, oh, right, actually, you know, I resented it at the time that even my dreams are kind of this kind of mundane task, but actually it was kind of helping me in some way. So yeah, very important thing there. And I think it's a good sign, isn't it? Like if you do something within your dreams, that's definitely your unconscious, you know, helping in some way. You know, so yeah, thanks for that input, Doreen. I think we're coming to the end of a really fascinating conversation about the subconscious mind. Thank you for everyone who's come up on stage with your input. Thank you for everyone in the audience as well for listening. We couldn't actually do this and you know, have a room like this without your support. So really appreciate that. Rowan, do you want to summarize what we've kind of discussed and learned so far talking about the power of the subconscious?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think like one point just on dreams before we do go. One of the things, a study that I came across was rats and mazes, and they found that they actually dream about the mazes that they've been running through the day in order to learn them. And I think this touches on something that you spoke about earlier as well, about replaying an interview or replaying something you've gone through the day. And if we replay that interview before we go to it instead of after we go to it, we can come out with all of the resistance that we might face in the interview. We can go through all the mistakes. And I'm sure anyone that does sports has worked with this sort of idea of running through something before you actually do it to get that level of competence. And they've done this with basketball players. I don't know if you know about this one, where they got I think it was 3 teams, and one of them was practicing every day shooting hoops, one of them was doing nothing, and one of them was at home visualizing scoring hoops all day every day. And the one that was visualizing shooting hoops and scoring them was the one with the best progress after a week of doing this, or a couple of weeks of doing this. So I think running things through the unconscious and using it as a tool And taking that conscious control is really, really important. But, as you say before, garbage in, garbage out. If we don't take control of that and start to put good things within our unconscious, that intuition, that autopilot, that automatic behavior that comes out of the unconscious, that is really the true power of the subconscious, is to be able to record things and replay them in a wonderful way. So if we have a good level of rapport with our unconscious mind, between the conscious and the unconscious, then we get a massive amount of power to pull that information back out and to rewrite those programs. And as hypnotists, I think a lot of the work that we do is really removing bad suggestion that's happened through life, through happenstance, or through negative self-talk from the individual themselves. So we're really giving back control rather than taking control from someone, as some people might think. And I think that a really good and useful model to have for dealing with your own unconscious is the idea that it's your big brother that's in control of everything that happens in your life. And they've shown this through fMRI scans. They can tell what you're going to choose before you consciously make the choice. So it's really an unconscious choice that's happening, and the conscious mind believes that it's made a conscious decision to press the red button or the blue button or whatever it happens to be, take the red pill, the blue pill. So if we look at our unconscious mind as the part of our mind, like a big brother or the universe itself, if you want to look at it that way, and give it gratitude for all of the gifts it gives us, whether they're painful and learning or whether they're joyful and good for our growth and our amusement. If we're grateful for everything, that's going to build that rapport with the unconscious mind. It's going to start to give you more of what you want from it. But a friend of mine who teaches lucid dreaming and does workshops, he's got a little saying he uses that says, "Thank you, universe, more please." Whenever he sees a synchronicity or has something nice happen to him, notices one of those shifts. And I think that's potentially a little bit arrogant, because it's asking the unconscious to give him more of what he wants, rather than allowing the unconscious to give him the gifts that it can give him. So I suppose that in itself would depend on whether we're looking at that unconscious mind as something that has a level of guidance ability to the conscious mind as well, over and above the programming that we put into it in this life. And that's where a spiritual aspect would potentially come in. But I think as far as the conversation today, the power of the subconscious is quite clear to me. It's whether we are in control or out of control of that. So build rapport with your own unconscious.
That's a very good summary. Are we harnessing it, or are we kind of being, effectively manipulated by our subconscious mind? There is, either a conflict there dynamic or a collaborative dynamic, and that could be, between conscious and unconscious, or different parts of the unconscious. I think it's been a great conversation. Thank you again to everyone that's joined us up on stage. Thank you everyone to the audience. If you've only joined for part of this, the full version is actually streamed live to YouTube, so that will be available to watch again if you have missed any parts. We'll be doing this next week on the same time. It'll be an hour and a half going forward. Thank you again for everyone's time, everyone's input. If you have got any suggestions for any future topics, you've got that little paper aeroplane thing there. You can send us a message, or you can follow either myself, Rowan, or Graham that normally joins us. Drop us a message, a DM on Instagram, put any requests in. We'll definitely consider all of them. This show is about us covering the topics that you want us to talk about, so feel free to suggest anything that you feel would be useful. Thank you again, and hopefully we'll see you next week. Take care.